Round 9 of the Superbet Chess Classic was pure drama. So going into today's round, these were the standings. As you can see, Levon Aronian and Wesley So were leading the way, but Maxime Vachier Lagrave was only half a point behind. So if he could win his game against Alireza Firouzja and the other two guys drew, then he would go joint top with them, would go to a playoff. So what would happen? Well, let's have a look at that game between Alireza and Maxime. So Alireza kicked off with d4. We had knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6. And now Alireza doesn't put the knight on c3 here, which you see most commonly. He wants to avoid the main line Grunfeld stuff. That's what Maxime loves to play. And so instead he goes knight f3. And after bishop g7, he goes pawn g3, preparing to fianchetto, and here Maxime goes for pawn c6, and he's going to set up this so-called neo-Grunfeld center. So after bishop g2, he goes pawn d5, very similar themes here, but we can see this pawn's on c6. You're not getting the usual Grunfeld play where white has the big center and you strike with c5 very early. So a different game here. Both players now castle, and there's many different ways to play for white in this position. You can take on d5, you can go pawn b3, queen b3 as a try, many moves. But this knight e5 move was selected by Alireza, and Peter Svidler mentioned that this was actually an idea of Kramnik's apparently some time back. So you immediately hit that outpost. Maxime took on c4. Now we see the knight jumping back. You know, lots of shades of the Catalan variation as well we can see on the board here. So after this knight takes on c4, the bishop came to e6, pawn b3 defended the knight, and now this bishop hit the d5 square. There's no e4 yet because the knight's not on c3, so these ones are likely to get exchanged. That's black's big idea here. So the bishop came to b2 developing. Now this knight came to d7, and here the best way for Alireza to play was actually to put the knight on d2. It's often not best to actually block this bishop in a lot of the lines, but he goes knight to c3, still not a bad move, hits that bishop. Now we see these ones exchanged, and here Maxime expands. He plays this really aggressive move, pawn to b5. So he kicks the knight out of this nice outpost. Now you don't want to come into e5 here because black can simply chop, knight g4, and you're losing a pawn, or if you go for a horrendous f4, well then the knight hops into e3. So none of this is working. So the knight actually hops back to d2 here, and now Maxime had an opportunity to actually play more safely. So he could have gone queen to b6, just preparing c5, getting rid of that backwards pawn, and it should be somewhere close to equality here. But he plays in a more enterprising way. He wants to push for a win, so he plays pawn e5. And the reason this is slightly riskier is that now you're leaving this pawn on c6 as a backwards pawn. It could be targeted later. You're striking at the center, yes, but okay, it's more risky. So Alireza captures, the knight took back, and now he hops this one in on e4 here, and he's actually threatening to take that knight. After the bishop recaptures, then he'll plant the other knight on e4 here. So that's why knight g4 was played. Now after captures on f6 with check, the knight recaptures, and it controls these key squares in the center of the board, stops the knight jumps, and whilst the knight sits there, the bishop remains blocked. So nice play from Maxime. Here Alireza goes queen to c2, and there's not so much to speak of in this position, but black has to still be a little bit careful because they've got the weaker pawn structure. So that one's targeted. We had queen e7 from Maxime, and now this rook came to e1, so Alireza's looking to expand with his central pawns, play e4 at the right moment, and here actually the best move would have been rook f to d8. And the idea is that after, say, pawn e4, you drop the knight back to d5. You're looking at both of those dark squares on c5 and e5. You've opened up the bishop. You could get some pawn a5 stuff going. Maybe a rook comes to the c file at the right moment. It's not to say black is better, but this was the more precise way to play. What Maxime did here, though, was go queen to c5. So this is a bit more tactical. He's now got ideas of pushing b4, playing knight d5, opening his bishop, and it's all to do with this queen and the fact that it's undefended right now on the c-file. So rook ac1 was very logical from Alireza. He defends that queen. Maxime brought his rook to the half-open file, and now knight d1 from Alireza, a good move, opens his bishop. We had an exchange here, the rook recaptures, and now that pawn on c6 is attacked, so Maxime goes rook to e6. And now although Alireza retreated his knight, he now brings it back into e3, controls that d5 square, and he's slightly better here, like said, all because of this pawn which Maxime is now babysitting. So he goes rook to d8 here, and now Alireza could have just played this rook to the c-file here. The reason he wouldn't have done this is this knight d5 move, and it just starts liquidating pieces basically. Now black's threatening to take there with check, so you'd have to chop here, but now black can chuck this one in, distract one of the rooks. Now the top computer line here is actually throwing in this knight e7 check. So okay, rook recaptures in this line, then this rook takes on b2, rook e6 defends the pawn, and now you don't really want to give your e pawn for c pawn, so the top line here is pawn e3, then king f8, the other rook comes to the c file, this rook defends the pawn, and basically Alireza will have foreseen this position and just thought it's not enough to win with just the one weakness there on the queen side. So he rejected this whole line. If I just run it back now, he didn't play this move of doubling on the c file, he went knight to f1 instead. So not technically the best move, but he wants to keep that tension in the position, keep fighting. So kudos for him for playing like this. Knight d5 now from Maxime. We had these bishops coming off the board here, and now the pawn came to a3. Alireza wants to set up this big centre if he can, e4, f3, that kind of thing. But he first goes a3, covers the b4 square from the knight jumps, and now a5 from Maxime. So he gets his majority going. And you could push e4 immediately here, but Alireza goes knight d2 first, just improving that one a bit before pushing that e4 move. And now Maxime goes pawn to b4. And on the one hand, this gives his knight the c3 square as an outpost, which looks nice. But after pawn a4, white's now got this beautiful c4 square for the knight. And once it lands there, it will also be hitting this a5 pawn. So this is risky from Maxime. But suddenly, out of nowhere, he pulls out this absolute thunderbolt of a move, and Alireza is very short on time at this point, by the way, a lot less than Maxime. He goes rook to e3 here. I mean, what a beautiful move. It really reminded me of an old game, actually, so I looked it up, and it was Alexander Alekhine against Richard Reti way back in 1925, and Alekhine slams down this rook e3 move, and he goes on to do this amazing checkmating attack, kills the white king, so you have to check that one out if you've never seen it. So rook to e3 played, shades of that game. Now you can't take this one, or the knight recaptures, you're picking up this rook with the check. This is no good, completely losing, but there is a really good way for white to play here. Now it looks so counterintuitive, but the best move is actually rook to b2. So you just hold this pawn, and I say counterintuitive because you've taken your rook off the file now, you're not attacking this one, it looks very passive. Black could go, say, rook to c3, but actually if you play like this with rook to c3, then amazingly, knight e4 is actually trapping that rook. It's just completely run out of squares. You'd have to go something like pawn c5, takes here, pawn recaptures, but this should never be enough for black. Even though you've got this supported pawn, e4 could be coming soon. Now the computer wants f5 to secure the square, but still none of it's very good. White should be winning this one. So if Alireza had found this whole idea of rook b2, then Maxime would have been forced to actually retreat this rook here, say all the way back to e8. Then you can hit the c4 square with the knight. This one's under fire, completely winning for white. Well, not completely winning, but very good anyway. Strategically busted, to be honest, with the way these pawns are and this knight outpost. So this was the way to go, but Alireza was so short on time, so he took on c6 here, And now Maxime can actually go rook c3. Now Alireza didn't want to be taking this one, giving the passed pawn. Again, the computer gives this as a drawing line technically, but this is very hard to assess, especially when you're low on time. So knight c4 was played, keeps this rook active in the enemy camp, targets this pawn, but you do drop the b3 pawn here. So Maxime snapped it off. Pawn e4 from Alireza. And now the rook came to the e-file, using the pin of the pawn against the rook on e1. And here again, Alireza was just so low on time, he couldn't find the way through. He's trying to attack the king in some way if he can. And so he went knight to d6 here, but it wasn't the best move. He should have just snapped off on a5 or played rook c5, let's say. There were different moves to start gobbling pawns on the queen side, steering it towards a draw. But he wanted to fight. He went knight d6. But now the rook comes to e6. And the problem here is you've just gone and pinned your own knight. And this one's now a very dangerous passer in all of these variations. So Alireza went rook d1 here. He targets this knight. It came back to f6. And now the best move here technically is rook to d4, but what a miserable move to make. Then black can go rook c3, the b pawn starts rolling. So Alireza actually went pawn e5 here, but this is just a terrible move. Now you don't take that pawn immediately, then rook c7 and you start getting a bit of play. But after knight to g4, this is just busted for white, because the pawn's under fire from the knight. You can't go f4 or you're walking into this simple tactic. And so Alireza now has to scramble here. He does go rook c7, but the knight hops back, covers the f7 square. That's why it's better to pick up this pawn with the knight and not the rook. And now f4 is a desperate try from Alireza. He does try and kick that knight and then pick up here, but rook d3 was a great response from Maxime, forces off these rooks, the knight recaptures, and yes, you do crash through here now, but when the king moves away, rook d7 to hold the knight, this is the problem now, pawn b3, and that one's just unstoppable without giving up your knight. So Alireza chucked in a check, king g7, rook d7, king f8, and now he hops back with the knight, so that after b2, he can actually snag that pawn, the knight recaptured, and we reach this technical endgame in just a moment now, where the pawns get liquidated on the queen side like this, and we've got the 3-on-2 on the king side, but black's got the extra piece, of course, so the only chance Alireza's got here is if he can liquidate all the pawns, go into the rook and knight versus rook endgame should be a draw. So we had this move started with first, pawn to g4, technically best was knight c4 here, but Maxime hops back. And now the best from Alireza was pawn h4, again playing on this whole theme of trying to liquidate pawns. But he goes king g3, also very natural. We had this check, king h4 now starts coming in, the knight came to f6, rook a8 check, king f7, another check here, and now the rook dropped back. You can never trade those ones off. The knight endgame with the two pawns is lost. So rook a5 played, knight e4, pawn f5, and so after this move of rook d7, Alireza does liquidate one pair of pawns, but this is where Maxime's very careful now. He can't let a second pair come off. So rook a4 played, hits the knight, rook e7 held it, the rook came back, king f6, and now you have to be careful here as white. There's actually threats to checkmate your king if you're not careful. So instead Alireza went pawn to g5 here. He kicks that king back, but now a really nice maneuver from Maxime. So king g4, knight d6. We see this knight now spin all the way around to the king side. The pawn came to h4 and knight g7. Excellent move. So it's coming into this h5 square here. It's rock solid there, holds the pawns, and now black's got this plan of just marching in the king. And the arrows I've drawn here are going to kind of show how the journey works. The rook just shepherds the king up the board, and then in combination with the knight, these pawns are gone. So king g4 played, rook d6, this one came to e4, trying to cut the king. So Maxime comes here, rook a4, king e6, rook a6 check, but rook d6 now, and this is the point, the king's slowly coming in. It's very hard to keep out. So sure and steady progress was made by Maxime. He chucked in this check. Now the king came to f5, rook a5 check, king e4, king g4 played, but now king e3 check. It's really in the heart of Firouzja's position. King h3, rook e4, the rook hopped back here, king f2, and after this check, king f3, another check, rook e3. Now it's curtains for Alireza, because after rook a4, now the knight joins the party, gives this check, and here Alireza resigned. It's just gone. You're either getting mated or your pawns are getting gobbled. Say you go king h2, for example, well, rook e2 check, king h1, king g3, you're threatening mate. And so if you go, say, rook a3 check, well, then we can actually pick up the pawn. The other one will drop soon. Game's gone. So great win by Maxime with the black pieces against Alireza. And this meant that he actually went joint top with Levon and Wesley because they both drew their games. So we went into a three-way playoff. Now the details are on screen of how that would work. Basically, they all play each other, and if they're still not decided at that point, then it would go to some Armageddon games. So the first game was between Wesley and Levon, and Wesley won. Then the next game was between Wesley and MVL won. Wesley lost on time. And then the third game, that's the one I want to show you now, that was between Levon Aronian with white and Maxime with black. So if Maxime won the game or even drew, then he would be the winner because he'd have the most points. So let's see what happened here. So e4 from Levon. Maxime goes c5, his favourite Sicilian. Knight f3, pawn d6. And now Levon didn't want some Najdorf debate. That's what Maxime plays. Very theoretical stuff. He went bishop to c4 instead. We had knight f6, pawn d3. This knight came to c6. Castles from Levon, and now pawn h6 from MVL, a really strange looking move, and the guys in the studio said this was actually a novel position already at move, what are we at, move 5, which is crazy, but there you go, pawn h6. So a4 now from Levon, we had pawn a6, rook e1, and the bishop now came to g4, pressuring there, creating more control over the dark squares. Pawn h3 kicked it, and after it dropped back to h5 here, Levon just went for it. Super aggressive, pawn g4. He was out for blood, so he kicks this bishop back. Then he drops his knight into h2, and after pawn e6, he goes f4. So he's absolutely just throwing the kitchen sink here at Maxime. But is it good? Well, you have to be so careful when you take this space. Yes, you take space, but you're creating this big vacuum of space in front of your own king. This can be very dangerous. So the bishop came to e7 developing, f5 now came, the pawn captured, this one took back. Now it looks like you've just absolutely entombed that bishop, which you have for the time being, but the problem is you've given up your entire centre here. So we can see that d5 is coming really quick now for Maxime in response. So knight c3 was played, but now d5. And look at white's bishop. That's completely squashed over on the queen side. So castles now from MVL. The knight came back to f3. And now queen c7 was a great move. It leaves the defence of the d5 pawn, but Levon didn't take that one because he doesn't want the queen landing here on g3, giving these devastating checks. So king g2 was played. This rook now came to the d file. Bishop d2 developed. And now the knight hopped into b4, hits the light squared bishop, and Levon really doesn't want to give that one up. That could be his pride and joy one day, blasting down the board if this pawn ever moves. So he comes back to b1 here, hoping he can move this one to e2, get pawn c3, liberated at a later point. So bishop d6 played. Look at these painful dark squares. This is one of the challenges now for Levon. The knight came back to e2. And now the rook hit the open file, and here Levon made a big decision. Once again, he wants to save this bishop, bring it back into the game, so he actually chopped on b4 here. The pawn recaptured, now he went bishop a2, but this is a massive decision because look at these horrible dark squares now. If this goes wrong, you're in big trouble. So the pawn now came to g6, excellent move from Maxime, looking to liberate that bishop. We had a captures there on g6, the bishop took back, and now MVL's really starting to come into the game. This king is not looking so cozy. So queen d2 was played, hitched the h6 pawn. It came up to h5 here, further trying to rip open lines. So Levon went g5, looking to keep things closed. But now can you see the absolute thunderbolt of a move that Maxime played here? Beautiful stuff. He went knight to e4. Just so thematic here, ripping open the lines. I mean, look at these rooks blasting down the board. Look at the bishops here. Look at the queen, the knight. Now, it wasn't immediately taken. If it had been, then the big problem here is just everything's getting ripped open. I mean, this knight's attacked. So where do you go? Well, d4 is horrible. I won't go into all that, but there's tons of pins down the d file. If you come to h4 here, then there's pawn e3. You're kind of playing pawn e3 no matter what white plays. You can see the lines this opens up, which I've drawn on the board for the bishops. So when the queen goes somewhere, let's say d4, then you can check here. Knight f3, this is just a sample line. There's different ways to play, but then this rook can lift into the game. This is one of the big problems as well. You're hitting the g5 pawn. I won't go too much deeper here because we see a lot of these themes later in the game, but that's the big problem. That's why the piece wasn't taken immediately. Instead, Levon went queen d1, pretty miserable stuff. And now the bishop landed on g3. Although it looks horrible, like you're about to give up the dark squared bishop, you don't want to take there and bring the queen in. So the rook came to f1 instead, just covering this square some more, coming away from this attack of the bishop. Pawn h4 cemented it, and now Levon takes the plunge. He does take on e4, opens up the rooks here, but after captures, at least he can plant his knight here. This is his whole idea. But once again, we've got the same problems for white. It's this rook e5 move, swinging into the game. Rook f6 now played from Levon, so watch out for your king side. This bishop's blasting, this pawn is pinned, so this one's now on prise, and that's why rook g5 was played. Could have been played anyway, but now you hold the bishop, of course, from that attack. So king h1 from Aronian, he steps off this file, he doesn't want the discoveries, and now an excellent move from MVL, he just drops this bishop back, double attacks these pieces here, whoops, this one here as well, and here Levon's actually forced to give up the rook. He takes on g6 with check, the rook recaptures, and he goes c3, bolstering his knight in the centre, and this is really desperate stuff now. His king's getting ripped to shreds, and rook d to d6 was an excellent move from MVL, lifting yet another heavy piece into the attack here. So the queen came to d2, opens up this rook. Now this one came to f6. We had rook g1 from Aronian, and now queen d7 played, targets this pawn here. So Levon chopped on g6, the rook recaptured, and he played the miserable looking knight g1, covering the pawn. Now you can't quite sack yet, king recaptures, takes here, because you've still got this one defending across the rank. So instead MVL just starts applying the pressure, he takes on c3 here, the pawn recaptures, but here he actually goes wrong. So he should play something like rook to g3 here, just continue invading, applying the pressure, but he actually picks up on a4, and they're suddenly both getting really low on time here, and the bar just absolutely swings. So if Levon had found knight to f5 here, suddenly the game's very, very even. There's not much in it at all. Now he plays bishop d5 instead, still a good move, but now this pawn's hit too, so this one was chopped off. MVL realised that knight could get dangerous, coming into f5, the pawn recaptured, queen e8 was played, holds the pawn, and MVL's now banking on these queenside ones to win him the game. The king's still exposed. So queen c2 was played now by Levon. He targets this pawn, and he also sets up a real cheapo here, as the guys in the studio called it. So if you go pawn to e3, then watch out for this one. Ouch, that's painful. Using the pawn once again. So he really set a trick there, but Maxime's not falling for it. He's too long in the tooth. He goes king to g7 here, steps off that pin, and now the bishop picks up on e4 though. So this is the downside of stepping the pin. You've lost the pawn, and white now has an asset. This is suddenly anyone's game. They're just playing on seconds here. So rook to g3 was played. The bishop came back to g2 holding. Now the guys in the studio there were calling for takes on b7, then dropping back. But this is actually a great move as well. b5 was now played. The knight came to f3. It's coming into the game. It's looking at this one. Queen d8 was played. Holds the pawn. Comes in front of the d pawn. Queen e4 now comes in invading. Queen f6 here. And now knight takes h4 was played. Levon picks up another pawn. This is just a slugfest now. Anyone's game. So the rook came to g5 here. Knight f3 back. Hits the rook. It came to f5. Looking to come into this f4 square. So we had pawn d5 from Levon. Rook f4. The queen came to d3. And now this one hit d6. A great blockading square. So knight d4 now from Aronian. He opens up the bishop, it holds the pawn. He's looking at knight f5 check, but queen e5 was played, holds that square, also attacks the knight, excellent move. And so the knight had to move, it hopped back to e2 here, and when the rook moved away, now it comes back into g3. Levon's constantly trying to get this knight f5 check stuff going. You can see how dangerous this could get for black. But queen e1 check played by MVL. He kicks the king up the board. Now the queen comes to d2, and you just can't trade queens here. That's a lost endgame with these ones coming so fast. The rook behind your own pawn. So the queen came to e4, and now king f8 from MVL. Excellent move. Stops this queen invasion, comes away from some of the checks. And now h4 from Levon. What else to do? Brilliant move. Gets this one going. The d pawn can't move yet. But b4 from Maxime. Look how fast his is coming down the board. King h3 played, breaks this pin, pawn b3, knight f5, and here we had rook e2, fantastic move, covering the e-file, covering the queen checks. So it came away to c4 here, but now what do you do as black? White's looking to check you here, but Maxime bravely goes pawn to b2, just ignores that stuff. And what he's seen is that if white goes check like this, then at least he can duck back that rook. That's why he's not getting mated. Then queen c5 check could come, and so on. But what Levon did here was start in the other move order. He went queen c5 check first. The king came to g8. And now there's just one move in the position, according to the engines here, to keep the equality. It's bishop to e4. And the idea is that when you start checking with the queen, and the king comes to h7, well, now you've got all sorts of discoveries with the bishop, and you've got the knight in play, and so on and so forth. There's lots of lines. Should technically be a draw, but of course you just play on instinct at this stage. You go queen c8 check, the king comes to h7, but now how do you actually continue? There's no more checks, the pawn's about to queen, Levon's looking, he's scrambling for a move, he grabs the knight, he chucks it on g3, but the flag drops. So he loses the game on time. Maxime wins. So out of nowhere, just trailing the leaders, he beats Alireza with black. Then he wins the playoffs and he wins the whole event. So congratulations to MVL. It's been a fantastic tournament. I really enjoyed the live commentary. I hope you've enjoyed these recaps. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.